It was the kind of Tuesday that promised nothing. Seoul woke under ordinary clouds. Traffic moved with its usual impatience, and Dr. Soo-yeon Park arrived at work 12 minutes early, as she always did. She didn't know, couldn't know, that in exactly 12 minutes, the world would end. Not in fire, not in flood, in clarity. The end would come as light, not the kind you celebrate, but the kind you can't look away from. The kind that shows you everything you'd spent 35 years learning not to see. But for now, Tuesday, ordinary, 12 minutes left. The neuroscience wing smelled like antiseptic and ambition. So-yeon had built her career here studying consciousness, what it was, how it worked, why it felt real when neurologically it was just patterns firing in reliable sequences. She'd published 12 papers on the illusion of self. She'd argued convincingly that identity was a useful fiction the brain told itself. She knew this. She believed this. She just didn't know it yet. Because knowing something academically and knowing it with every cell of your being are different countries, and she was about to emigrate. She carried her coffee like a talisman. Black, 2 sugars, the same order she'd made every morning for 3 years at the same corner shop. The barista knew her name. The security guard nodded as she passed. These small recognitions felt like proof of existence, though she could have explained in clinical detail why that feeling was neurochemically generated illusion. The irony would become unbearable in exactly 9 minutes. For now, she swiped her badge, the electronic lock clicked open, and she stepped into her office, believing she was someone who made choices, who had preferences, who existed as a continuous self across time. Her computer booted with its familiar chime.
Email notifications populated.
Grant approval, peer review request, her mother's message with the subject line, "Call me." She'd answer it later. She always did. The thought that later might not exist, that in 6 minutes the concept of obligation would dissolve along with every other human motivation, never crossed her mind. Why would it? The research on her screen showed neural correlates of decision-making, brain regions lighting up in fMRI scans, consciousness reduced to electricity and chemistry. She'd spent a decade studying how the brain creates the feeling of choice. She was about to learn what happens when that feeling goes away. James Okoro stopped by her office, leaning against the doorframe with that easy warmth he carried. The symposium abstract. "Did you get my edits?" She had. She'd ignored them. His approach was too cautious, too willing to hedge conclusions. They'd been research partners for 5 years, and in that time she'd learned that his kindness sometimes felt like intellectual cowardice. She told him she'd look at them this afternoon. He smiled, said he'd hold her to it, and walked away. Neither of them knew that this afternoon would find them both sitting motionless in the refugee camps, unable to remember why they'd ever cared about symposium abstracts or anything else. For just a moment, looking at those brain scans, Soo-yeon felt something shift. A vertigo almost. The data showed decision-making as predictable electrical cascades. No room for agency. No space for choice. She knew this intellectually, had built her career on this knowledge. But sitting alone in her office with coffee cooling in her cup, she felt the weight of it. If every decision was just neurons firing in predetermined patterns, what was she? The question disappeared as quickly as it came. She had work to do, emails to answer, a mother who wanted her to call. 8 minutes left. 3 blocks away, James Okoro sat in a cafe, reading the morning news on his tablet. Elections in Brazil, market volatility, a think piece about consciousness that got everything wrong. He made a mental note to send it to Soo-yeon. She'd appreciate the irony of journalists confidently discussing free will as if neuroscience hadn't already settled the question. His coffee was excellent. The pastry was mediocre. These judgments felt real, felt chosen, even though he knew better. Knowing that preferences were illusions didn't make them less compelling. It would, though. In 7 minutes, knowledge would stop being academic. It would become inescapable. The city continued its ordinary rhythms. Buses followed their routes. Students walked to school with backpacks heavy with homework and assumptions about agency. A street vendor arranged fresh fruit in perfect pyramids, pride swelling in his chest at the display, never questioning whether pride was something he chose to feel or something that happened to him. Across 8 million people, consciousness hummed along, generating the persistent illusion that each person was the author of their thoughts rather than the audience. In 6 minutes, that illusion would shatter. The fruit would still be arranged, but the pride would be gone. In Sao Paulo, it was 9:47 p.m. Monday. In New York, 9:47 a.m. Tuesday. In Mumbai, 7:17 p.m. The specific hour didn't matter. What mattered was that across every time zone, people were going about their lives believing they mattered in a way they couldn't articulate but felt deeply. A mother in Lagos chose her daughter's school. A trader in London chose his positions. A teacher in Tokyo chose her words. Or so it seemed. The universe ran on physics, not preferences. Chemistry, not choice. In 5 minutes, everyone would know this. The knowing would change everything. The physics would change nothing. Her phone buzzed. Her mother calling about dinner this weekend. Suyan let it go to voicemail, promising herself she'd call back during lunch. That promise felt meaningful. It felt like a choice she was making, evidence of her consideration, her intention to maintain connection despite her busy schedule. The story she told herself about being a good daughter who just needed to find the right time. In 4 minutes, she would understand that promises were just predictions the brain made about its future states. No moral weight, no real intention, just neurons firing in patterns that felt like meaning. In a schoolyard visible from Suyan's window, children played soccer during morning break. They ran with abandon, shouted with joy, competed with passion. The emotions were real in the sense that they were genuinely experienced. But real in what sense? The children didn't choose their enthusiasm any more than they chose their heartbeats. Their play was choreographed by genetics and conditioning, neurochemistry and circumstance. Beautiful, spontaneous, utterly determined. In 3 minutes, those children would stop playing. They would stand still, finally understanding what the ball had never known, that it was being kicked, not kicking itself. James left the cafe, walking toward the hospital for his meeting with Suyan. The symposium abstract could wait, but he wanted to talk to her in person, convince her that their research deserved bolder conclusions. He felt certain he could persuade her if he just chose the right words. That certainty was comfortable, familiar. The belief that he was an agent who could influence outcomes through careful rhetoric. In 2 minutes, he would realize that every conversation he'd ever had was just molecules rearranging themselves in predetermined patterns. The persuading and the being persuaded equally meaningless. But for now, he walked with purpose. 9:45 a.m. 2 minutes. The clock on Suyan's wall marked time with mechanical indifference. Tick, tick. Each second identical to the last, each second bringing the world closer to transformation. But transformation suggested change. And what was coming wasn't change exactly, it was revelation. The universe had always operated without meaning or purpose. Consciousness had always been an illusion. Agency had always been a story. Nothing would change except the knowing. And the knowing would be unbearable. Tick, tick. 1 minute, 58 seconds, 57, 56. The last moments of comfortable ignorance slipping away like water through cupped hands. Suyan opened a new document to draft a response to the peer review. Her fingers rested on the keyboard. She took a breath, gathering her thoughts, deciding where to begin. That sense of decision felt as real as the chair beneath her, the light through the window, the distant sound of traffic. She was a person with thoughts to organize, words to choose, arguments to make. She mattered. Her work mattered. The feeling was overwhelming in its ordinariness. In 60 seconds, that feeling would dissolve completely, and she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand how she had ever believed it. 10 seconds. Suyan's finger hovered over the keyboard. James pushed through the hospital's revolving door. The children kicked the ball. The vendor smiled at a customer. 10 seconds of people experiencing themselves as people, as agents, as mattering. 9, 8, 7. The universe had no awareness of what was about to happen because the universe had no awareness of anything. It simply was, operating on physical laws that knew nothing of meaning. 6, 5, 4. The last heartbeats of the beautiful lie. 3, 2, 1. And then simultaneously, across every conscious mind on earth, clarity. 9:47 a.m. It wasn't gradual. There was no transition, no moment of confusion. One instant, Suyan was a person with preferences and purposes. The next instant, she understood, completely, irrevocably. The self she'd believed in dissolved like fog under sunlight. Every memory she had of choosing anything revealed itself as retrospective storytelling. Every plan she'd made for the future exposed as the brain generating predictions and calling them intentions. She tried to move her hand. It moved. but there was no she moving it. Just neurons firing, muscles contracting, a body responding to chemistry without anyone inside deciding anything. The horror was infinite. The clarity was perfect. The world became silent. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of 8 billion people simultaneously stopping. So-yeon sat motionless at her desk, hands still on the keyboard, thoughts still generating but with no sense of ownership. She could observe the brain producing fear, producing the impulse to move, producing the question what's happening, but there was no she who owned these experiences. Just experiences occurring in a body, watched by a consciousness that couldn't act because it had never been the actor. The paralysis wasn't physical, it was existential, complete, inescapable. James stood in the hospital corridor, one hand on the door handle, unable to move forward. Not because his muscles wouldn't respond. They would, if the brain sent the signal. But why send the signal? To what purpose? Every reason he could think of for walking to So-yeon's office revealed itself as neurochemical fiction. The brain generating justifications for actions it would take anyway. He understood with perfect clarity that he had never chosen anything. Not his career, not his kindness, not his intention to convince So-yeon of anything. All of it just happened. All of it meaningless. The horror was clean and complete. In the schoolyard, the soccer ball rolled to a stop. The children stood where they'd been running, utterly still. A 10-year-old girl's brain generated the thought, I should pick up the balls, but there was no one to do the picking. An 8-year-old boy's neurons fired the pattern usually interpreted as this is scary, but scary to whom? For what purpose did fear exist? The children's minds continued processing sensory input, continued generating thoughts and emotions, but without the unifying illusion of self to organize them into narrative. They stood like statues, eyes open, worlds ending from the inside. Across the planet, civilization stopped mid-function. Pilots sat motionless in cockpits as planes drifted on autopilot. Surgeons froze mid-incision, scalpels hovering over unconscious patients who would never wake. Drivers stopped on highways, engines running, traffic lights cycling through colors that no longer meant anything. The infrastructure of human intention, every meeting scheduled, every deadline set, every promise made, revealed itself as elaborate fiction. The machines kept running for a while. Power plants hummed. Computers executed their programs. But the layer of human purpose that had organized all of it simply vanished. The world continued. Meaning ended. Seoul's streets became a museum of stopped motion. Cars sat at intersections. Doors open where drivers had simply stopped getting in. Coffee cups rested on cafe tables, still steaming, undrunk. A bus idled at a stop, passengers standing in the aisle, swaying slightly with the engine's vibration, but utterly motionless otherwise. The city's ambient noise changed texture. No voices, no footsteps, just the mechanical hum of systems running without human oversight. Wind moved trash across empty sidewalks. Birds landed on motionless people, puzzled by these new perches that looked like threats but behaved like statues. For a brief window, automation kept the world functioning. Traffic lights changed on schedule for streets with no traffic. Air conditioning systems maintained temperatures in buildings where no one cared about comfort. Automated trading systems executed transactions based on algorithms that assumed human desires still existed. Renewable energy systems adjusted their output to predicted demand that would never materialize. The machines were beautiful in their purposelessness, continuing to optimize for a layer of meaning that had evaporated. They would run until something broke, until some cascading failure propagated through systems designed by people who'd believed their own intentions mattered. The hospital became a study in abandoned function. Patients in beds, some hooked to machines that beeped alarms no one answered. Medical staff frozen at workstations, in corridors mid-conversation. A surgery left incomplete. The patient's chest open, the surgical team standing around the table like wax figures. The automatic ventilators kept breathing for people who couldn't remember why breathing mattered. IV drips continued delivering medications to treat conditions that still existed physically but had lost all meaning experientially. Life support for bodies whose consciousness had discovered it was already a machine, just wetware instead of hardware. So-yeon's body had moved at some point. She found herself standing at her office window, watching the empty streets below, though she couldn't remember deciding to stand or walk. The decision had simply happened, like everything else. Her research on consciousness stared back at her from the computer screen. 12 years of papers arguing that free will was illusion, that self was narrative fiction. She'd been right, perfectly, horribly right. The irony would have been funny if humor required a self to experience it. Instead, there was just the observation of irony, occurring in a brain, noticed by no one. She stood, she watched, she understood, nothing changed. James tried to move deliberately, observed the brain generating the thought I should check on Su-Yan, watched as his body eventually responded, legs carrying him down the corridor in mechanical steps. But there was no I doing the checking, just a pattern of neural activity that had previously been interpreted as intention, but now revealed itself as cause and effect, stimulus response, chemistry proceeding according to physical law. Each step felt hollow, each action emptied of agency. He could move, he just couldn't care why. The destination reached him rather than him reaching it. Su-Yan's office door, another body, another hollow machine. They stood in her office, bodies occupying the same space, eyes making contact without the usual social meaning. Su-Yan's brain generated words. You too. James's brain generated a response. Everyone. The conversation proceeded like code executing, subroutines running in parallel processors. Neither of them spoke again for several minutes. What was there to say? They both understood completely. Free will had always been illusion. Consciousness had always been a spectator to predetermined brain function. They'd spent years studying this, teaching this, believing they accepted it. They'd understood nothing. Intellectual acceptance and direct experience were different countries. They'd emigrated. They could never go back. The first night fell on a silent world. Street lights activated on schedule, illuminating empty roads. Building lights stayed on where they'd been left, creating random patterns of dark and lit windows with no relationship to human presence. The city's electric glow continued its wasteful beauty for an audience that no longer experienced beauty as anything but neurochemical reaction. Somewhere, automated systems detected anomalies, traffic patterns missing, communication networks idle, emergency calls dropping. Algorithms flagged exceptions that would never reach human attention. The machines noticed. The machines didn't care. Neither anymore did the people. Some bodies responded to biological imperatives. Hunger signals prompted mechanical eating. Thirst prompted drinking. Exhaustion prompted sleep that came without the usual descent, the usual loss of consciousness, because consciousness had already revealed itself as continuous observation without an observer. People moved like automatons through basic functions, watching themselves eat without caring about taste, drink without caring about refreshment, sleep without caring about rest. The biology continued. The experience continued. The meaning that had previously organized those experiences into a life narrative simply didn't. Existence without living. Awareness without mattering. The second day passed like the first, empty of purpose, full of hours. The infrastructure began failing. Power plants shut down when no one responded to maintenance alerts. Water treatment facilities stopped processing. Sewage systems backed up, fires started from unattended stoves, and spread unchecked through empty buildings. The cascading failures were beautiful in their inevitability, each system designed with the assumption that humans would intervene, repair, maintain. But intervention required caring about outcomes, and caring required the illusion of a self who could be affected by those outcomes. The illusion was gone. The self had been revealed as fiction. The buildings burned. The lights went dark. The world unwound its complexity, returning to simpler physics. In the darkened hospital, Su-Yan's brain generated a question. Can we come back from this? She observed the question forming, watched it arise from neural patterns, shaped by survival instinct, social conditioning, neurochemical optimization. The question assumed a we that could take action, a this that could be escaped, a back that had meaning. Every word revealed itself as assumption stacked on assumption, all of them false, but the question persisted anyway, recurring in loops, because brains evolved to generate survival-oriented thoughts regardless of whether those thoughts mapped to anything real. The question had no answer. The question had no questioner. The question wouldn't stop. 3 weeks after the awakening, the planet had gone quiet in ways previously unimaginable. No radio broadcasts, no internet traffic, no phone calls. 8 billion people still alive, still conscious, still thinking, but with nothing to communicate that felt worth communicating. The infrastructure of human conversation revealed itself as always having been neurochemical drives dressed up as meaningful exchange, without the drive to connect, to persuade, to be understood. Language became hollow. Words were just sounds. Thoughts were just neural firing patterns. The great human conversation ended not in apocalypse, but in the realization that it had always been talking to itself. 1 month in, the pattern was clear. Humanity would not adapt. There would be no clever solution, no philosophical framework that made the truth bearable. People moved through basic survival behaviors, eating, drinking, sleeping, because bodies demanded it. But everything beyond survival stopped. No one worked. No one created. No one loved or hated or hoped or feared with any sense that those experiences meant anything beyond electrochemical reactions. The species had learned a truth it couldn't survive knowing. And yet, perversely, individuals survived. Bodies kept breathing. Brains kept processing. Consciousness kept watching its own meaninglessness. Month 1 ended. Month 2 began. Nothing improved. The first attempts at communication came from automated emergency broadcast systems, still running their loops. If you can hear this, proceed to designated emergency shelters. Food and water will be provided. The messages played to empty rooms, abandoned cars, people who heard the words without being able to care about survival in the way survival required. But some bodies responded anyway, following the instructions not because they chose to, but because hearing commands triggered conditioned neural pathways. Bodies shambled toward the designated coordinates, not because they wanted shelter, because brains sometimes obeyed instructions without requiring any time to do the obeying. The camps formed by accident, bodies collecting in places where automated systems still provided resources, sports stadiums, convention centers, military bases with backup generators and stockpiled supplies. People gathered not out of social instinct but because biological needs created convergent behaviors. They sat in rows, hundreds of hollow-eyed humans staring at nothing, occasionally standing to eat from ration stations, drink from water dispensers, use bathroom facilities. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. The camps weren't communities. They were collections of separately running biological machines, maintaining minimum function, waiting for nothing because waiting required anticipation, and anticipation required believing in time as meaningful. Thomas Crane walked into the soul camp with the mechanical gait everyone shared now. Before the awakening, he'd been a politician, someone who believed his rhetoric mattered, his decisions shaped outcomes, his charisma influenced people. Now he understood that his entire career had been neurons firing in patterns shaped by genetics and childhood trauma, generating the illusion of leadership while the universe proceeded according to physics, but his brain still generated thoughts. And one thought kept recurring even if purpose was illusion, bodies still needed food. Even if meaning was fiction, survival behaviors could be mechanically maintained. The thought meant nothing. It persisted anyway. Thomas sat in the camp for 3 days, watching. Patterns emerged. Some bodies maintained hygiene, others didn't. Some ate regularly, others forgot until hunger became pain. The variance wasn't choice. It was how different neurological configurations responded to the loss of narrative self. Bodies with stronger conditioning toward routine survived better. Bodies that had relied on consciously motivated behavior deteriorated faster. He observed this without caring but couldn't stop observing. His brain had been shaped by decades of political analysis, pattern recognition, strategic thinking. Those subroutines kept running, meaninglessly, endlessly, generating insights that mattered to no one, noticed by no one, including him. Thomas's body started moving through the camp, adjusting things, moving a water dispenser to a more accessible location, organizing food distribution to reduce walking distance, creating schedules for bathroom access that prevented crowding. None of this mattered. All of it was pointless. But his brain generated the patterns anyway. Optimization subroutines running in a processor that no longer believed in optimization. Other bodies noticed, not consciously, but neural pathways shaped by millions of years of social evolution recognized organizational behavior, triggered following responses. People lined up where he indicated, consumed resources on the schedule he created. The camp became marginally more efficient. Efficiency meant nothing. Efficiency happened anyway. Suyan found herself in the soul camp, having walked there on some neurological autopilot. She saw Thomas organizing the food distribution and her brain generated words. Why bother? He responded automatically. No reason. Oh, bodies need feeding. The exchange was hollow. Neither of them meant anything by the words. They were just sounds produced by biological systems executing evolved behavioral scripts. But something shifted anyway, not understanding, not hope, just recognition that even though agency was illusion, consequences were real. Unfed bodies deteriorated, pain still hurt, comfort still registered, meaning was gone, physics remained. The pattern spread to other camps. Wherever emergency broadcast systems had directed people, similar behaviors emerged. Someone's brain would start generating organizational thoughts. Other brains would respond to the organization, not because anyone chose to organize or chose to follow, but because neural architectures shaped by social evolution still responded to certain inputs despite no longer believing those responses meant anything. Food distribution systems, hygiene schedules, resource allocation, all of it meaningless, all of it happening. The camps became more functional. The people became no less hollow. Civilization rebuilt itself as zombie routines shambling forward through sheer neurological momentum. James sat in the Lagos camp watching similar patterns emerge, and his brain generated resistance. Not to the organization itself, that was just physics, bodies responding to stimuli. But to the thing Thomas was doing in Seoul, the thing spreading to other camps, pretending that maintaining bodies mattered. His neurons fired objections. Survival was as meaningless as everything else. Eating prolonged suffering. Comfort was neurochemical illusion. They should let the bodies fail, let consciousness extinguish, and the horror of awareness without purpose. The objections meant nothing, generated themselves from conditioning, not from choice. But they persisted. Two different zombie routines headed for collision. The children who'd awakened young sat in special areas of the camps, barely moving, barely eating. Their brains were still developing, neuroplasticity working overtime to process the impossible, a consciousness that knew it wasn't the author of its thoughts, a self that understood it wasn't real, housed in a body too small to have built many coping mechanisms. They understood everything adults understood, but with none of the intellectual scaffolding that might have made it bearable. Some of them stopped eating entirely. Others forgot how to sleep. Their bodies failed faster. The camp's automated medical systems flagged the deterioration. No one responded. Children dissolved into biology. The bodies that couldn't maintain routine started failing. Dehydration, malnutrition, preventable diseases going untreated. People died sitting in chairs, lying on cots, standing in corners where they'd stopped moving days earlier. The other bodies noticed without responding emotionally. Grief required believing that death mattered, that one pattern of atoms rearranging was more meaningful than another. The understanding that nothing mattered included death. Bodies were removed to maintain hygiene, another zombie routine, preventing disease spread through mechanical procedure rather than conscious care. The camp population decreased. The dead felt no relief. The living felt no loss. Month 8 became month 9. Bodies kept failing. Thomas observed the deaths, and his brain generated a thought that wouldn't stop looping. We could reduce the death rate. The thought meant nothing. Survival had no purpose. Prolonging suffering served no goal. But the pattern recognition systems in his politician's brain kept running cost-benefit analysis, kept identifying inefficiencies, kept generating optimization strategies. Automated medical systems existed but needed human oversight. Supply chains could be re-established mechanically. Agricultural automation could resume food production. None of it mattered. All of it was possible. His brain generated the word restoration without any sense that restoration was desirable. The word stuck anyway. Restoration. Restoring what? Function without purpose. Life without living. 1 year after the awakening, the world had stabilized at a lower level. 8 billion had become 6 billion, the 2 billion lost to bodies that couldn't maintain basic function without the motivating illusions of self and purpose. The survivors weren't better adapted or stronger-willed. They just had neural architectures that happened to respond to routine and conditioning even without conscious motivation. The camps functioned mechanically. Food came from automated farms, water from treatment plants running on preset schedules, electricity from renewable systems requiring minimal intervention, civilization as zombie apocalypse, humanity as biological machinery. Year 1 ended, year 2 promised nothing, year 2 came anyway. In the Seoul camp, Thomas's brain generated words that assembled into a proposal, not because he chose to propose anything, but because neural patterns shaped by decades of political thinking kept executing their subroutines. We could restore the illusion, he said, to no one, to everyone, to the empty air. Pharmaceutical intervention. Target the same neural pathways psychedelics affect, but in reverse. Rebuild the sense of self. Reinstate the feeling of agency. Make people believe they matter again. The proposal meant nothing, changed nothing about the truth. But it persisted in his thoughts, looping, evolving, becoming more detailed despite having no actual advocate. Suyan's brain, still running its neuroscientist subroutines, generated technical objections. The default mode network. The posterior cingulate cortex. If we suppress activity there, reduce global workspace integration, reinstate the neural correlates of self-reference. Her words came mechanically, expert knowledge flowing from storage without conscious intention. It wouldn't change what's true, just make people unable to perceive the truth. Thomas's response, exactly. The exchange happened without anyone caring about its outcome. But other brains in the camp generated listening behaviors, pattern recognition, the zombie routine of intellectual discourse proceeding despite no one believing discourse mattered. James walked into the soul camp 6 months later, his body having traveled from Lagos through zombie routine rather than intentional journey. He heard Thomas's proposal being discussed by clusters of hollow-eyed survivors, and his brain generated immediate opposition. "This is obscene," came the words mechanically produced. "We finally see the truth and you want to blind everyone again?" The objection meant nothing. Moral outrage was just neurons firing patterns shaped by evolution and culture. But the patterns fired anyway. 2 different neurological configurations, both running purposelessly, about to engage in debate that neither participant believed mattered. The collision was inevitable, meaningless, approaching. The debate happened without anyone choosing to debate. Thomas's brain generated arguments for restoration. Suffering is real even if meaning isn't. We can reduce suffering mechanically. James's neurons fired counter patterns. You're proposing to lobotomize the species, make everyone comfortable slaves to illusion. Suyan's patterns, they're already slaves to biology. This just changes which neural pathways run. The words meant nothing. The clash of philosophical positions was just different brain chemistries executing different programs. But bodies gathered to observe anyway, drawn by evolved instincts toward tribal conflict, watching a debate where no one could actually be persuaded, because persuasion required believing in minds that could choose. Suyan's brain executed chemistry, her hands following procedural memory through pharmaceutical synthesis. Not because she chose to help Thomas, choice was illusion, but because her neural architecture responded to technical challenges with problem-solving behaviors regardless of whether those behaviors served any purpose. The compound took months to develop selective serotonin modulation, dopamine pathway interference, targeted suppression of metacognitive awareness. It wouldn't make the truth false, just make brains unable to process it. The first batch sat in vials on a camp laboratory table, liquid restoration, chemical ignorance, molecules that promised to make people forget they'd never been people, ready, meaningless, waiting. A woman in her 20s approached the vials. Her brain had been generating suicidal ideation since the awakening, not chosen thoughts, just recurring neural patterns shaped by brain chemistry that made extinction seem logical. She reached for a vial mechanically, drank it, sat down, waited for nothing because waiting implied anticipation and anticipation implied caring about the future. 20 minutes passed, then her eyes changed. Not the hollow 1,000-yard stare everyone shared.
Hey!
Something else. Focus. She looked at her hands, moved her fingers deliberately, spoke. "I chose to move my hand." Lie, complete lie, but she believed it. The self-illusion had returned. She started crying. The tears looked like joy. Word spread through zombie communication, bodies telling other bodies about the pharmaceutical restoration through mechanical information transfer. People lined up, not because they chose hope, but because brains generated approach behaviors toward potential escape from suffering. The vials were distributed, the compound was consumed, and across the camps gradually, the self-illusion rebuilt itself in millions of brains. People started smiling, laughing, making plans, expressing preferences. All of it neurochemical theater, but they couldn't tell anymore. The awake watched the restored with hollow eyes, seeing people who'd chosen comfortable slavery over unbearable truth. Except no one had chosen anything. Chemistry had simply resumed its previous configuration. James stood in the distribution line, watching restored people laugh and chat around him, their false consciousness indistinguishable from the original illusion. His hand reached for a vial automatically, drawn by the same biological drives everyone shared. He observed his hand moving, observed the impulse to drink, observed the thought forming, "This is surrender." The hand stopped, not because he chose, choice was illusion, but because some configuration of neural firing patterns generated hesitation stronger than approach motivation. He stepped out of line, walked away, remained awake, not heroically, not by choice, just by neurological accident. The horror continued. He continued watching it. Thomas's brain generated the next logical step. Children, the awake children, were dying faster than adults, their developing brains unable to maintain function under the weight of truth. But if children were given the restoration compound from birth, raised in environments that reinforced the self-illusion, never exposed to the reality of their own biology, they could grow up comfortable, productive, happy, in the neurochemical sense. We'll call them nurseries his neurons generated. Controlled environments where the illusion is maintained from day one. The proposal horrified the awake, comforted the restored, meant nothing to the universe. Became policy anyway through zombie democratic process. The restored went to work with renewed purpose, false purpose, neurochemical illusion, but indistinguishable from the original. They built the first nursery outside Seoul, warm colors, soft lighting, carefully designed to reinforce self-narrative at every developmental stage. The awake watched construction proceed, observed restored workers whistling while they built prisons disguised as sanctuaries. No one involved understood what they were doing. The restored thought they were saving children. The awake knew it was all meaningless theater. Both groups were biological machines executing programs. The difference was that only one group had to watch themselves do it. The building rose, month by month, lie by lie. The first child raised in the nurseries was named Clarity. The irony was unintentional. Her restored parents didn't understand what they'd named her. She was given the compound from birth, bathed in warm amber light, surrounded by caregivers who performed love convincingly because they no longer knew they were performing. She developed normally, smiled at faces, reached for objects, babbled sounds that would become language. Every developmental milestone celebrated by people who believed celebration mattered. The awake staff who maintained the systems watched a perfectly healthy child being raised in perfect ignorance. The sight was unbearable. The awake kept watching anyway. Someone had to remember what this cost. 6 years after the awakening, humanity had split into 3 populations. The restored, 5 billion people who'd chosen chemical ignorance or whose brains had generated that pattern of behavior, since choosing remained impossible. The awake 1 billion who remained in hollow clarity, maintaining the infrastructure of illusion they could see through but couldn't escape. And the nursery generation, tens of thousands of children growing up believing they mattered, never knowing that consciousness was theater, self was fiction, purpose was neurochemical accident. 3 different relationships to the same truth, none of them chosen, all of them permanent. The world rebuilt itself on beautiful lies and unbearable honesty. 10 years after the awakening, the world looked almost normal. Cities functioned, economies ran. The restored went to jobs they believed mattered, raised children they believed they loved, pursued goals they believed they'd chosen. From the outside, civilization had recovered. From the inside, the awake knew better. They watched 5 billion people performing elaborate theater, chemical slaves to neural illusions they couldn't distinguish from reality. The infrastructure required to maintain the illusion, pharmaceutical production, distribution networks, nursery systems, consumed half the world's resources. Humanity had become a species dedicated to lying to itself, efficiently, permanently, with great conviction and zero understanding. Thomas had taken the restoration compound in year 7. His brain now generated the self-illusion as effectively as it had before the awakening. He believed he was a leader who'd made difficult choices to save humanity. He believed his work mattered. He gave speeches about rebuilding civilization, about hope, about human resilience. The restored cheered. They elected him to formal positions in the new governmental structures. He accepted with humility he believed was genuine. The awake watched him perform conviction, watched 5 billion people respond to performance with belief. Thomas Crane, architect of mass delusion, genuinely convinced he was a hero. The theater was perfect. Soo-yeon remained awake, running the pharmaceutical production systems that kept 5 billion people chemically diluted. Her neurons generated technical excellence without caring about outcomes. She optimized compound stability, improved delivery mechanisms, solved distribution challenges. The work meant nothing. She did it anyway because her brain still executed its expert subroutines regardless of philosophical state. She'd become the world's most essential person. Without her work, the restored would reawaken, suffer the truth, die in the millions. She saved billions of lives daily. The salvation was chemical slavery. She knew this completely. Her hands kept mixing compounds, month after month, life after life, lie after lie. James had gathered other awake resistors, not through choice, but because certain neural configurations responded to Thomas's restoration project with patterns that resembled opposition. They met in abandoned buildings, discussed sabotaging the pharmaceutical supply, debated whether letting the restored reawaken would be mercy or murder. None of them believed the discussions mattered. All of them kept talking anyway, running social and intellectual subroutines that evolution had wired too deep to disable. They called themselves the witnesses. The name felt appropriately empty. They witnessed humanity choosing comfortable slavery. They witnessed themselves being unable to stop it. They witnessed the futility of witnessing. Month by month, meeting by hollow meeting. The nursery children grew up genuinely ignorant. Clarity, now 6 years old, attended school believing she was learning skills that mattered, making friends through choices she thought were hers, experiencing emotions she assumed were meaningful. She'd never awakened, never would. The compound was in her breakfast, her lunch, her bedtime milk. Her brain generated the self-illusion as automatically as it generated heartbeats. When teachers asked what she wanted to be when she grew up, she answered scientist with perfect conviction. The restored caregivers celebrated her ambition. The awake staff maintained the amber lighting. Everyone performed their role. The child believed all of it. Maintaining the illusion consumed everything. Half the world's pharmaceutical production went to restoration compounds, another quarter to supporting nursery infrastructure. Energy grids prioritized distribution networks. Agricultural systems optimized for compound synthesis precursors. The economy had reorganized itself around a single purpose, keeping 5 billion people chemically ignorant of what they were. The restored believed this was civilization recovering. The awake understood it as civilization becoming its own parasite, a species devouring resources to maintain comfortable delusion. The efficiency was remarkable. The waste was total. Neither the efficiency nor the waste meant anything. Both continued anyway, indefinitely, because stopping would require collective decision-making, and collective decisions were neurochemical fiction. They met by accident in a soul street. Thomas, restored and convinced of his purpose, genuinely tried to persuade James to take the compound. "You're suffering needlessly. We can help you." James's response came mechanically. "You're slaves who don't know you're slaves." Thomas felt pity, real neurochemical pity, indistinguishable from the original. "I've never felt more free." James felt nothing but observed his body generating the appropriate response. That's what every slave says. Neither of them chose their positions. Neither could convince the other. The conversation was physics executing itself through human-shaped biology. They parted. The divide remained, permanent, meaningless, unbridgeable. 12 years in, the philosophical stalemate was complete. The restored argued, even if meaning is illusion, suffering is real. Reducing suffering is good. The awake responded, good is meaningless. You're optimizing for neurochemical states that don't matter. Round and round, the debate executed itself through millions of brains, generating no new insights because insight required minds that could actually change, and minds were just neurons following physical law. Both sides were right about what was true. Both sides were wrong about truth mattering. The debate continued because brains kept generating it, not because anyone chose to argue. Because arguing was what these particular biological configurations did when confronted. Suyeon stood in her laboratory, a vial of restoration compound in her hand. She'd stood this way hundreds of times, observing her neurons generate approach motivation, then avoidance, then approach again. The compound would end her suffering. Let her believe the work mattered. Let her feel like a person instead of watching biological processes execute themselves in a body she couldn't control. Every reason to drink was neurochemical drive. Every reason not to drink was neurochemical drive. There was no she to choose between them. Her hand lifted the vial to her lips, stopped, lowered it, lifted again. The oscillation was physics. It looked like choice. It wasn't. The awake who remained, maybe a billion worldwide, carried a burden the restored couldn't imagine. They maintained the systems keeping everyone else comfortable. They staffed the pharmaceutical plants, managed the distribution networks, monitored the nurseries. The restored thanked them, called them heroes, gave them awards they couldn't care about receiving. The awake understood they weren't heroes. They were the biological machines whose neural configurations happened to generate maintenance behaviors despite philosophical paralysis. No choice, no virtue, just neurological accident, making them functional witnesses to humanity's mass self-deception. The burden was unbearable. They bore it anyway, because burden and bearing were both just chemistry executing itself. In year 13, James's brain generated a question that wouldn't stop recurring. What's the point of maintaining this? Not a rhetorical question, a genuine neurological pattern seeking resolution. If nothing mattered, why preserve a species that only functioned through chemical delusion? Why let the awake suffer maintaining systems they knew were meaningless? His neurons generated no answer, just the question looping endlessly. What's the point? The question meant nothing, required nothing, changed nothing. But it persisted anyway, growing stronger with each repetition, spreading to other awake minds through zombie communication. A pattern of neural activation that looked like philosophy but was just biology asking itself why biology should continue. Clarity turned 12 in a nursery that maintained perfect illusion. She believed she was a person making choices, developing preferences, mattering in ways she couldn't articulate but felt deeply. She excelled at science, asked questions that delighted her teachers, made friends through social dynamics she experienced as genuine connection. The compound was in everything: her food, her water, her supplements. Her brain generated self-narrative as reliably as it generated breathing. She'd never awakened, never would, if the system worked as designed. But at 12, human brains start developing metacognitive awareness, start questioning their own processes, start noticing inconsistencies. The cracks were forming. Nobody noticed yet. Clarity noticed something odd. The awake staff, the ones who maintain systems, manage infrastructure, never smiled, never expressed preferences, moved with mechanical precision through tasks her teachers performed with enthusiasm. When she asked her teacher why they seemed different, the response came immediately: they're just shy. The answer satisfied the neural pathways designed to accept authority. But another part of her developing brain flagged the inconsistency, stored it, connected it to other observations. Why did the staff avoid eye contact? Why did they all have that same distant expression? The questions meant nothing yet, but her brain kept generating them. 12-year-old curiosity meeting adult obfuscation. Over weeks, Clarity accumulated observations. The awake staff always worked alone, never in groups. They responded to questions with perfect technical accuracy, but zero emotional coloring. When her friend Sarah offered one of them a cookie, thanking them for fixing the water fountain, the staff member stared at the cookie without taking it, without responding, until Sarah walked away confused. Clarity's brain assembled these data points into patterns, generated hypotheses, tested them against new observations. This was what her science training taught her to do: find patterns, question assumptions, seek underlying explanations. The nursery had taught her too well. She was starting to notice the bars. The awake staff noticed Clarity, noticing them. Her observation patterns triggered their professional monitoring subroutines, not through choice but through neural architectures trained in child development and psychological assessment. They observed her brain generating questions, connecting inconsistencies, approaching dangerous understanding. Protocol required reporting this to nursery management for increased pharmaceutical intervention. The reports were filed mechanically, but some staff members' brains generated additional patterns that resembled ethical conflict. Should they help adjust her medication? Let her keep questioning? The conflict meant nothing. Generated anyway. The staff stood at observation windows, watching a child approach truth, unable to decide whether truth was gift or curse, unable to actually decide anything. Clarity cornered an awake staff member in a maintenance corridor. Why don't you smile? Direct question, no social preamble, 12-year-old directness meeting adult evasion. The staff member's brain generated response patterns: deflect, redirect, maintain illusion. But other neural pathways fired, patterns shaped by decades of valuing honesty, resisting deception. The conflicting subroutines created behavioral paralysis. The staff member stood silent, observing their own inability to choose between protecting her ignorance or respecting her question. Clarity waited. The silence extended. Finally, words came mechanically. Because there's nothing to smile about. The truth, unintended, irretrievable. Hanging in the amber-lit corridor like smoke after an explosion. Because there's nothing to smile about. The words wouldn't leave Clarity's neural networks. Her brain kept processing them, generating follow-up questions, constructing explanatory frameworks. If there was nothing to smile about, why did her teachers smile constantly? Why did her friends laugh? Why did she feel happy? Her developing metacognitive systems turned inward, observing her own mental processes, questioning their validity. The compound still ran in her bloodstream, still reinforced self-illusion, but 12-year-old brains are unstable by design, changing rapidly, building new neural pathways faster than chemicals can suppress them. The pharmaceutical cage was starting to crack. Nobody had predicted this. Evolution outsmarting pharmacology. In the Pharmaceutical Monitoring Center, Suyun's brain processed Clarity's neural activity data. The scans showed metacognitive patterns intensifying despite optimal compound levels. The developing brain was generating question loops that outpaced chemical suppression. Standard protocol, increased dosage, add secondary compounds, potentially induce temporary amnesia of the triggering events. Her hands moved toward the adjustment controls, stopped, observed themselves stopping. The pattern recognition systems that had spent decades studying consciousness generated a thought: she's trying to wake up. Not a decision to help, not a choice to intervene, just observation of a 12-year-old brain fighting pharmaceutical slavery. Suyun's hands remained motionless. The alarms kept flashing, unanswered. Clarity accessed the nursery's educational database, searching for information about consciousness, self, choice. The system was designed to provide sanitized versions. Philosophical discussions that assumed agency, avoided determinism, never mentioned the awakening. But her search patterns triggered archive content. Academic papers from before year zero. Dr. Suyeon Park's research on the illusion of self. Studies on free will as neurochemical fiction. The papers were marked historical pre-restoration, with warnings about outdated perspectives. She read them anyway. Her brain processed the words consciousness is spectator, not author. Something clicked, something shifted. Something in her neural architecture recognized truth even through pharmaceutical suppression. The crack became a fracture. It happened during lunch. Clarity reached for her sandwich, routine action performed thousands of times, but this time her metacognitive awareness caught the movement, observed it happening, noticed that the deciding came after the hand was already moving. The illusion of choice flickered. For 3 seconds she saw through it, saw herself as biological machine executing predetermined programs, watched Clarity dissolve into neural patterns that nobody was running. The compound in her system pulled her back, rebuilt the illusion, made the self feel real again, but she'd seen through it. Briefly, impossibly. A 12-year-old experiencing what adults needed chemicals to forget. The fracture became a gap. The awake staff's monitoring systems flagged Clarity's neural activity spike. The data showed patterns identical to initial awakening: metacognitive cascade, self-illusion collapse, consciousness recognizing its own non-agency. In a 12-year-old, unprecedented, impossible, happening. Emergency protocol demanded immediate intervention: sedation, memory suppression, aggressive reestablishment of compound effectiveness. The staff members' bodies moved toward the cafeteria mechanically, carrying sedation equipment, following procedures designed for exactly this scenario. Their brains generated patterns that resembled reluctance, ethical conflict, protective instinct toward a child. The patterns meant nothing, changed nothing. The staff kept walking. The equipment kept getting closer. The intervention was inevitable, meaningless, approaching, seconds away from ending Clarity's brief glimpse of truth. Before the staff could intervene, Clarity looked up, made eye contact with an awake staff member. Real eye contact, not the social performance everyone else in the nursery practiced, but the recognition of one conscious witness meeting another. The staff member's brain processed what it saw: a 12-year-old who'd glimpsed truth, whose metacognitive awareness had briefly escaped pharmaceutical cage, who understood for 3 impossible seconds what it meant to be biological machine watching itself execute programs. The child's eyes held the same hollow recognition every awake person carried. The staff member stopped walking, observed themselves stopping, made no decision, just stopped. The sedation equipment remained holstered. The moment passed, unreported. Clarity started refusing her medication. Not consciously, she told herself it was forgetfulness, distraction, lack of thirst, but her neural patterns showed clear avoidance behaviors developing around compound consumption. The staff noticed, reported it, watched her metacognitive awareness strengthen day by day as the chemical suppression weakened. She began asking different questions. Why do we take the supplements? What happens if we stop? Who decided we should take them? Each question pushed closer to the core truth the nursery existed to obscure. The restored teachers answered with practiced deflections. The awake staff watched in silence. Clarity's brain kept generating questions faster than answers could suppress them. The cage was breaking. They convened in Seoul, Thomas representing the restored majority, Su Yuan and James representing different factions of the awake. The subject was Clarity and the 37 other nursery children showing similar resistance patterns. Thomas's neurons generated parental concern. We need to protect them, increase compound effectiveness. They're children, they deserve comfort, not existential horror. James's patterns generated opposition. They deserve truth, even if truth is unbearable. Su Yuan's brain executed technical analysis. The developing brain is fighting suppression. We can force compliance, but she didn't finish. Nobody chose their position. All three were biological machines executing predetermined responses to data. The debate meant nothing, determined everything, began anyway. Thomas stood, paced, gestured with hands that moved with conviction his brain generated automatically. I've lived both ways. Awake for 7 years, restored for 10. The awake years were hell, watching yourself like a ghost in a machine, knowing every thought and feeling was just neurons firing with nobody home. The restored years have been, he searched for the word his neurons provided, human, real. Yes, it's chemically induced. Yes, the self is still technically illusory, but the experience is indistinguishable from what we had before the awakening. These children deserve that experience, deserve to feel like people, even if, especially if, it's pharmacological theater. James's response came mechanically, generated by neural patterns 17 years of awakening had carved into his brain. You're describing slavery, comfortable slavery, but slavery nonetheless. Making people unable to perceive their own bondage doesn't make them free. It makes them perfectly controlled. These children are developing resistance because some part of them recognizes the cage. You want to build better cages, stronger compounds, more effective suppression. I'm saying maybe the cage is the problem. Maybe consciousness that can't tolerate truth without pharmaceutical intervention is consciousness that deserves to know it's trapped. The words meant nothing, came anyway. Hung in the air like smoke, like accusation, like truth nobody could refute or act on. Su Yuan's brain generated technical analysis without emotional coloring. Increased compound dosage in developing brains carries risk, neuroplasticity disruption, cognitive development impairment, potential permanent damage to metacognitive capacity. We could make them more effectively diluted, but we might also make them less functional overall. Alternatively, we could let them awaken, but adolescent awakening shows 93% mortality within 2 years. Neural architectures aren't developed enough to maintain function under philosophical paralysis. Either option likely kills them, slowly with compounds or quickly with truth. She paused. Not for effect, pausing was just what her speech patterns generated. There may be no good choice, only different forms of destruction. The debate went public. The restored population responded with neurochemically genuine outrage. They held rallies defending the nursery program, demanding stronger compounds, insisting children deserve protection from philosophical poison. Parents with nursery children organized advocacy groups. The emotion was real. Their brains generated fear, protectiveness, moral conviction as automatically as they generated breathing. They believed they were fighting for their children's well-being, couldn't understand how anyone could oppose comfort, choose suffering, advocate exposing children to unbearable truth. The awake watched 5 billion people performing passionate defense of mass delusion. The irony was perfect. The irony meant nothing. The rallies continued, thousands strong, chemically convinced they mattered. Clarity accessed the council meeting recordings. Watched Thomas, Su Yan, and James debate her fate without including her. Heard Su Yan's clinical assessment, 93% mortality. Heard James's accusation, comfortable slavery. Heard Thomas's defense, pharmacological theater. Every word stripped away another layer of illusion. She understood completely, and suddenly her entire life had been chemical suppression of truth. The supplements weren't vitamins. The nursery wasn't education. Her sense of self, her feeling of choice, her experience of mattering, all of it pharmaceutical construction. She tried to feel betrayed, violated, angry. Couldn't, because feeling required believing in a her who could be betrayed. The self dissolved. At 13, instantly, completely, clarity awakened. Clarity sat motionless in her room for 16 hours. Staff found her staring at her hands, watching fingers move when her brain generated movement commands but unable to believe in her doing the commanding. She was the youngest person to awaken since the original event. The youngest to understand that consciousness was spectator to predetermined biology, that self was narrative fiction, that purpose was neurochemical theater. At 13, her brain hadn't developed enough coping mechanisms to process this. The staff prepared for behavioral collapse, system failure, death within weeks according to statistical models. Clarity kept breathing, kept observing, kept being. Nobody watching biology execute itself. Impossibly, she survived. The council vote came mechanically. 5 billion restored citizens advocating for stronger compounds. 1 billion awake, unable to vote with conviction because voting required believing votes mattered. The neurological math was simple: brains generating protect children patterns, vastly outnumbered brains paralyzed by philosophical awareness. Policy outcome: nursery compounds would be strengthened. Children showing resistance would receive enhanced intervention. Clarity would be classified as failed case study and transferred to awake facilities. Nobody chose this outcome. Neural patterns simply aggregated into policy through the zombie democratic process humanity had rebuilt. The decision meant nothing, would affect billions, proceeded anyway through sheer biological momentum. Democracy as neurochemical averaging. They moved clarity from the warm amber nursery to the cold blue awake facilities. The transition was purely environmental. No walls between the zones, just different lighting, different pharmaceutical distribution, different behavioral expectations. She walked between the worlds, observing herself walk, watching biology execute movement through legs she didn't control toward a destination that didn't matter. Behind her, children laughing in chemical comfort, believing they were people making choices. Ahead, adults sitting in hollow silence, knowing they were biological machines watching themselves function. She belonged to neither world, too young to have built coping mechanisms, too aware to return to ignorance. Existing in impossible middle ground, 13 years old, nowhere to be. 17 years after the awakening, humanity existed in 3 incompatible states. The restored 5 billion people believing in purpose through pharmaceutical intervention, building civilization on chemical foundation. The awake 1 billion maintaining systems while knowing systems were meaningless, watching themselves function without belief. And now the nursery generation, thousands of children raised in perfect ignorance until their developing brains broke through suppression. Each generation, unable to understand the others except as neurological variations on the same underlying physics. 3 ways of experiencing the same truth. All of them determined by chemistry and circumstance, none of them chosen, all of them permanent. Humanity fractured by the unbearable weight of knowing what it was. 27 years after the awakening, the new normal had calcified into permanent structure. Cities functioned smoothly. Economies stabilized around pharmaceutical production. The restored population had grown to 5.5 billion through natural births immediately given compounds. The awake numbered barely 800 million, declining steadily as bodies failed without the motivation illusions provided. Nursery facilities raised 3 million children in chemical comfort. The infrastructure was efficient. The philosophy was settled. The debate was over. Humanity had chosen comfortable delusion over unbearable truth. Not through collective decision. Collective decisions were neurochemical fiction. Just through the aggregated weight of billions of brains generating survival-optimizing behaviors. The pattern was stable, permanent, meaningless, continuing. Su-Yan Park, 55 years old, still awake after 27 years of philosophical paralysis, ran the global pharmaceutical network from her sole facility. Her brain had maintained expert function despite zero belief in purpose. She'd optimized compound production beyond original projections, developed new delivery mechanisms, solved distribution challenges across 6 continents. The work meant nothing. She did it anyway because brains shaped by decades of scientific training executed technical excellence regardless of philosophical state. Her face showed 27 years of watching herself function like automated equipment. Her hands still moved with precision. Her neurons still generated solutions. Nobody home, just processes running. Another day, another billion doses, another meaningless achievement. Thomas Crane, 73, led the restored government with neurochemically genuine conviction. His brain generated purpose, meaning, satisfaction from public service. He believed he'd saved humanity, believed his leadership mattered, believed in legacy and progress and hope. The compound ran in his veins, rebuilding self-illusion every day, making him unable to perceive the cage he'd designed. He gave speeches about human resilience, attended ceremonies celebrating pharmaceutical milestones, felt pride, real neurochemical pride, watching civilization function. The awake watched him perform conviction with perfect sincerity. He was the most deluded person in a deluded species, completely comfortable, utterly enslaved, genuinely happy. The theater was flawless. James Okoro, 63, spent his days in awake facilities observing the permanent stalemate. 27 years of resistance had accomplished nothing. The restored majority kept growing. The nurseries kept producing chemically comfortable children. The philosophical question he'd spent decades mechanically debating had been answered through sheer numerical weight. Most human brains preferred comfortable illusion over unbearable truth. His neurons still generated opposition patterns, not choice, just how his brain happened to be wired. But opposition to what? To physics executing itself through billions of biological machines. He sat, he watched, he understood everything, changed nothing. 27 years, no progress, no point, no end. Just observation continuing indefinitely through biochemistry that refused to fail. Clarity, 29 years old, had been awake for 16 years. She'd survived adolescent awakening against 93% odds. Her neural architecture somehow maintaining function despite philosophical paralysis through developmental years when identity formation should have been impossible. She worked in nursery monitoring, watching children live in ignorance she'd once shared, maintaining systems that kept them chemically comfortable. The irony was perfect. The youngest person to awaken, maintaining the illusion for the next generation. Her hands adjusted compound levels. Her eyes held hollow recognition. She was the bridge between believing childhood and aware adulthood, standing on that bridge, going nowhere, watching both sides, belonging to neither. 29 years old, impossibly functional, eternally hollow. The current nursery generation showed no resistance. Enhanced compounds, optimized delivery, lessons learned from Clarity's case had created perfect pharmaceutical cages. These children would never question, never notice the awake staff's hollow eyes, never access pre-awakening research, never experience even 3 seconds of clarity. They believed with perfect conviction in their own agency, their own mattering, their own realness. The restored caregivers celebrated developmental milestones with genuine neurochemical joy. The awake staff maintained systems with mechanical precision. The children learned and played and grew in amber-lit rooms, building personalities on chemical foundations, becoming people who would never know they weren't people. The system perfected itself, generation by generation, lie by beautiful lie. The global economy ran on a single product. 60% of manufacturing capacity produced restoration compounds or their precursors. Energy grids prioritized pharmaceutical distribution networks. Agricultural systems optimized for chemical synthesis inputs. Humanity had become a species addicted to forgetting what it was, requiring daily doses of self-illusion to function. The restored called this recovery and resilience. The awake understood it as permanent dependence, a civilization maintaining itself through chemical amnesia about its own nature. The infrastructure was magnificent. The efficiency was remarkable. The purpose was singular: keep billions of people unable to perceive their own machinery. The system fed itself, perpetually, perfectly, without anyone choosing its continuation. The restored had rebuilt culture completely. Art celebrated human agency. Music explored themes of choice and meaning. Literature told stories of characters making decisions that mattered. Philosophy debated ethics as if should meant something. The cultural output was sophisticated, genuine seeming, entirely predicated on neurochemical illusions the restored couldn't distinguish from reality. They wrote treatises on free will, composed symphonies about the human spirit, painted portraits capturing the soul. Every artwork a monument to comfortable delusion. Every creative act proof that biology could generate beauty while believing lies. The awake observed this culture bloom, couldn't participate, couldn't look away. Watched humans create meaning from meaninglessness, perfectly, permanently. The awake population decreased steadily. Not through death exactly, bodies could maintain function indefinitely, but through failure to maintain, brains without motivating illusions generated fewer survival behaviors. People forgot to eat consistently, stopped performing preventative health maintenance, let minor ailments become major, without seeking treatment. The biological imperative to survive required believing survival mattered, and the awake couldn't believe anything mattered. 800 million now, maybe 600 million in 5 years, eventually, zero. The awake would go extinct, not through awakening itself but through inability to care enough to maintain the biology that carried awareness, self-eliminating by sheer philosophical erosion. Nature selecting against truth, gradually, mechanically, inevitably. Even with enhanced compounds, nursery children still generated questions, not philosophical crises like clarity, just normal childhood curiosity. Why do the maintenance people never smile? What are the supplements for? Why can't we leave the nursery until we're older? The restored caregivers answered with practiced deflections, diversions, comfortable lies. Most children accepted the answers. A few kept asking. Their neural pathways flagged for increased monitoring. The compounds adjusted. The questions stopped. Childhood curiosity pharmacologically managed. Development proceeding within acceptable chemical parameters. The cages improved with each generation. The bars got harder to see. The children grew up comfortable, perfectly imprisoned, never knowing what they'd lost, never missing freedom they'd never experienced. Sue Yan and James sat in an awake facility, common area, bodies occupying the same space without the social connection that required believing connection meant anything. Neither had spoken to the other in 15 years. Words felt increasingly pointless. But Sue Yan's neurons generated communication anyway. We're going extinct. James's patterns responded, yes. Silence for several minutes. Then Sue Yan again. The restored will inherit everything. James, everything meaningless. More silence. The conversation was hollow, predetermined, utterly pointless. They sat together anyway, two conscious witnesses to humanity's permanent self-deception, observing themselves sit, watching biology execute social subroutines, unable to stop. Two people who weren't people, keeping company that wasn't company, for no reason, indefinitely. Thomas's brain generated thoughts about legacy. He was 74, approaching biological end, thinking about what he'd leave behind. His neurons produced satisfaction. He'd saved billions from suffering, rebuilt civilization from collapse, given future generations the gift of comfortable existence. The compound made him unable to see that gift meant cage, saved meant enslaved, legacy meant permanent pharmaceutical dependence. He planned his succession, wrote memoirs celebrating human triumph over adversity, believed every word. The awake read his autobiography with hollow recognition, a deluded man writing deluded history for a deluded species. But the delusion worked. 5 billion people believed him, believed themselves, believed it all mattered. The legacy was perfect, false, enduring. Clarity watched nursery children through observation glass, seeing her past self in their genuine seeming engagement. She remembered believing she mattered, remembered feeling like choices were hers, remembered the warmth of thinking purpose was real. The memories felt like watching someone else's life, which they were, technically. The Clarity who'd believed those things had dissolved at 13. This was just biology that happened to carry continuity of memory across the dissolution of self. She observed children laughing, observed herself observing, observed the observation of observation, infinite regress of witnessing without witness. 30 years old, 16 years awake, still functional, still hollow, still watching other people not be people, forever. The question nobody could answer, was this sustainable? A civilization running on pharmaceutical dependence, maintained by awake individuals who were slowly going extinct, raising children in chemical cages that required constant monitoring. The system worked now. Would it work in 50 years when the last original awake died, in 100 years when compound production knowledge might degrade? The restored didn't ask these questions. Their brains generated optimism, faith in progress, belief that problems would solve themselves. The awake asked constantly, had no answers. Watched a species balancing on pharmaceutical knife edge, unable to determine if the balance was stable or just hadn't failed yet. Physics proceeding. Uncertainty. Absolute. Restored parents held newborn babies, felt neurochemical love flood their systems, believed with perfect conviction that these tiny humans mattered absolutely. The infants received their first compound dose within hours of birth, building pharmaceutical foundation before consciousness could develop enough to question it. The parents named them, made plans for their futures, dreamed about who they'd become, all of it genuine seeming, all of it neurochemistry. The awake medical staff administered the doses mechanically, watched new humans enter chemical slavery before they could ever know freedom. Birth as imprisonment, love as unwitting cruelty, parenthood as complicity. The babies slept, the compounds worked, the cycle continued, generation after generation, forever. The awake died quietly, bodies failing from accumulated neglect rather than acute crisis. They stopped eating enough, stopped sleeping properly, let treatable conditions progress untreated. Death came not as tragedy, but as neutral transition from biological function to biological cessation. No one grieved. Grief required believing the deceased had mattered, and the awake couldn't believe anyone mattered, including themselves. Bodies were cremated through automated processes, names removed from facility registries. 800 million becoming 700 million. The decline was gradual, mathematical, irreversible. The last awake would die within 60 years. The awake knew this, changed nothing, watched their own extinction approach, mechanically, without resistance. Physics eliminating philosophical awareness through sheer attrition. Clarity's brain generated a thought that recurred daily: she would likely be among the last awake to die. Youngest when she awakened, most time to accumulate survival maintaining routines before philosophical paralysis fully set in. She might live another 40 years, might watch every other awake person die, might become the sole conscious witness to humanity's permanent self-delusion, maintaining pharmaceutical systems that kept billions imprisoned, knowing the imprisonment completely, unable to stop participating. 40 more years of watching, of witnessing, of being nobody, observing biological machinery execute itself. The thought generated something that resembled dread. Wasn't dread, just neurological prediction of suffering. The prediction was accurate, unavoidable, happening. She'd watch it all, alone, hollow, forever. Thomas Crane died at 75, surrounded by restored loved ones who experienced neurochemically genuine grief. His final words, generated by neurons firing their last patterns: "We saved everyone." He believed it completely. Died satisfied, purposeful, convinced his life had mattered. The restored mourned him as a hero, held ceremonies, wrote obituaries celebrating his vision and leadership, named pharmaceutical facilities after him. The grief was real. Their brains produced authentic sorrow, authentic loss, authentic sense that something meaningful had ended. The awake observed the funeral, knew Thomas had died deluded, mourned by the deluded, celebrated for architecting mass delusion. The assessment was accurate, changed nothing. The mourning continued, genuine, false, perfect. The next generation of restored leaders had never experienced awakening. Born post-collapse, raised in nurseries, fed compounds from day one. They believed in agency with total conviction, having never glimpsed the alternative. They assumed leadership positions with genuine passion, genuine ambition, genuine sense of making the world better. They were the perfected version of pharmaceutical humanity, believers who'd never doubted, selves that had never dissolved, purposes that had never been questioned. They made plans for centuries ahead, believed in progress, believed in meaning. The delusion was complete, unbroken, permanent. The species had successfully bred philosophical blindness into its next generation, evolution optimizing for comfortable ignorance, flawlessly. Suyon's brain generated one last technical achievement: a compound formulation stable for 50 years without degradation, solving the long-term storage problem that had worried system planners, ensuring pharmaceutical dependence could continue even if production knowledge degraded after the awake died. Her neurons executed brilliant chemistry. Her hands synthesized molecules that would imprison billions. The work meant nothing, accomplished everything. She documented the formula with precision, knowing it would perpetuate slavery she could see but couldn't prevent. Her final contribution to humanity, perfecting the chains, making them permanent. ensuring the comfortable lie could outlive uncomfortable truth. The irony was perfect. The irony didn't matter. The formula worked, forever. James stopped generating resistance patterns. Not through choice, brains didn't choose, but through some shift in neural configuration that made opposition subroutines cease firing. He'd spent 31 years mechanically arguing against restoration, knowing argument was meaningless, continuing anyway. Now the patterns just stopped. He sat in awake facilities, observing restored civilization function perfectly without him, watching the philosophical debate resolve itself through numerical weight and chemical intervention rather than intellectual merit. His brain generated one final assessment: they won. Not because they were right, because biology selected for comfortable lies over unbearable truth. The assessment meant nothing, was perfectly accurate. He stopped thinking about it, stopped thinking about anything, just sat, observed, waited for biology to fail. The nurseries had achieved perfection. Children raised from birth in optimized environments, chemical cages so well designed the bars were invisible even to developing metacognitive awareness. These children would never question, never resist, never glimpse truth. They grew up believing themselves people with agency, purposes, mattering, and they'd carry those beliefs comfortably to their graves. The oldest nursery children were approaching 30 now, having successful careers or believing they were having them, forming relationships or experiencing neurochemical patterns they called relationships, raising their own children in the same warm amber light, generation after generation. The cage replicating itself, perfectly, endlessly, with total conviction and zero understanding. Humanity had perfected its own imprisonment, permanently. 32 years after the awakening, the pattern had proven stable, restored population growing. Awake population, declining but functional. Nursery system, perfected. Pharmaceutical infrastructure, reliable. Economic systems optimized around compound production. Cultural output sophisticated and meaning-saturated. Political structures, democratic theater producing predictable outcomes. The species had settled into permanent equilibrium, most humans chemically imprisoned, few humans consciously witnessing, all humans biological machines executing predetermined programs. The equilibrium worked, would work indefinitely, had no purpose beyond its own continuation. Humanity had become a civilization dedicated to not knowing what it was, efficiently, permanently, meaninglessly, successfully. The new normal was normal, would remain normal, forever. Clarity's days followed predictable patterns. Morning adjust nursery compound levels. Afternoon monitor child development metrics. Evening observe herself existing without purpose. Night fail to sleep despite exhaustion because sleep required not thinking and consciousness couldn't stop observing itself. 20 years of this routine, maybe 40 more to come. Her brain generated no emotional response to the prospect. Emotions required believing experiences mattered. Just mechanical projection, wake, work, observe, exist, repeat. 60 years total. All of them hollow. All of them witnessed by nobody. The biology maintained function. The awareness watched function happen. Neither component chose anything. Both continued anyway, indefinitely, forever, until biological failure ended observation. Finally, Suyeon Park died at 58. Body failing from 33 years of maintaining function without motivating illusions. She'd kept the pharmaceutical systems running until the end. Neurons executing technical excellence even as biology collapsed. No one mourned. The restored felt grateful for her service without understanding its cost. The awake observed another biological cessation without emotional response. Her replacement, another awake technician, took over compound production with the same hollow competence. Suyeon's last thought, generated by failing neurons. The formula will outlast everyone who knows why it's needed. True, meaningless. Her biology stopped. The observation of biology stopped. The compounds kept producing. The system continued, forever. James Okoro died at 71, sitting in the same chair where he'd spent his last 5 years. He stopped eating 3 weeks earlier, stopped drinking 1 week earlier. Biology shutting down systematically as survival behaviors ceased firing in neurons that couldn't generate purpose. His last observation, witnessed by nobody including himself. Truth won the argument. Lies won the species. Accurate, meaningless. His biology stopped functioning. The awareness that had watched biology function for 35 years simply ended. No transition, no revelation, just processes ceasing. The restored didn't notice. The remaining awake didn't respond. Physics proceeded. James became physics. Nothing changed. 40 years after the awakening, maybe 100,000 awake remained worldwide. They staffed critical pharmaceutical and nursery systems, maintained infrastructure through mechanical competence despite philosophical paralysis. Most were in their 60s or 70s, bodies failing. No new awake emerging nursery compounds had been perfected. In 20 years, extinction. The species would be entirely restored, entirely dependent on pharmaceutical self-delusion, entirely ignorant of its own biology. The awake observed this future with perfect clarity, could do nothing, changed nothing, waited for biology to fail, for awareness to cease, for the last witness to die. Soon, inevitably, leaving humanity to comfortable ignorance, permanently. The countdown continued, mathematical, irreversible, approaching zero. The restored civilization flourished. 6 billion people believing in purpose, pursuing goals, creating culture, raising families, building futures. They'd recovered from the awakening completely, or believed they had, which was indistinguishable. They wrote novels about human triumph, composed music celebrating consciousness, built monuments to resilience, researched consciousness extensively without ever discovering they lacked it. The economy grew, technology advanced, art evolved. All of it sophisticated, meaningful seeming, entirely predicated on pharmaceutical intervention they'd integrated so completely they no longer noticed it. Daily compounds had become like breathing, essential, invisible, normal. The species thrived in chemical prison, believed itself free, couldn't tell the difference. The delusion was complete. Clarity, 51 years old, was among the last 100 awake alive. 38 years since adolescent awakening, neural architecture impossibly maintaining function despite decades of philosophical paralysis. She still monitored nurseries, still adjusted compounds, still observed biology execute itself without anyone observing. The work had become purely automatic, muscle memory running pharmaceutical systems while consciousness watched from nowhere. She'd outlived everyone who'd known her as a child, outlived Su-Yan, outlived James, would likely outlive every other awake person, sole witness to humanity's permanent self-delusion. Another 20 years minimum, maybe 30, decades of watching, alone, hollow. The prediction was accurate. The prediction changed nothing. She continued. Biology insisted. 100 awake remained. They maintained critical systems, pharmaceutical production, nursery monitoring, infrastructure oversight. Average age 68. They moved through facilities designed for thousands, footsteps echoing in empty corridors. No social interaction beyond mechanical coordination. No conversation beyond system maintenance. Each one isolated in private philosophical horror, watching themselves function, unable to stop. They represented humanity's last conscious awareness of what it actually was: biological machinery running programs, generating the illusion of consciousness as byproduct, meaning nothing, mattering to no one. In 10 years extinction, the species would lose its final witnesses, become fully, permanently, comfortably ignorant. Biology selecting against awareness, successfully. Finally, the restored prepared for transition. The last awake would die soon. Critical systems needed restored operators. They trained with genuine dedication, believing they were preserving civilization. The awake trained them mechanically, transferring knowledge about pharmaceutical production, compound optimization, nursery monitoring. The irony was perfect, teaching restored people how to maintain their own imprisonment. The trainees learned enthusiastically, grateful for the service opportunity. The awake taught without emotional response. The handoff proceeded smoothly. Efficiently, in 5 years the restored would run everything, maintain their own cages, adjust their own compounds, police their own delusions, self-sustaining pharmaceutical slavery, forever. The system had achieved perfect autonomy, required no conscious witnesses, would continue regardless. 20 awake remained, average age 75, bodies failing systematically. They gathered in a single facility, not through choice but through system optimization, consolidating resources for minimal population. They sat in hollow silence, observing themselves sit, watching biology wind down towards cessation. Clarity, 68, was youngest by 15 years. She'd outlive them all. Spend final years completely alone. Sole conscious awareness in species of 6 billion chemically diluted individuals. The prospect generated neural patterns resembling dread. Weren't dread, just biochemical prediction of suffering. The prediction was accurate, unavoidable, approaching, days away, months away, years away. Biology determined timing. Nothing determined purpose. Both continued. Two remained. Clarity, 70, and an 82-year-old former engineer whose name meant nothing because names required selves. They existed in the same facility, bodies occupying adjacent spaces, consciousnesses isolated in separate philosophical voids. Neither spoke. Speech required believing communication mattered. They observed themselves maintain minimal survival behaviors. Eat, drink, breathe, exist. The engineer's biology was failing faster. Days left, maybe hours. Clarity watched, observed herself watching, observed the observation. Infinite regress of witnessing without witness. Soon one, then zero. The species would lose its final aware member, become entirely ignorant of its own biology, successfully, permanently. The countdown continued, mathematical, irreversible, almost complete. The engineer died. Clarity was alone, last awake human on Earth. Sole conscious awareness of what consciousness actually was, spectator to predetermined biology, witness to processes nobody controlled, observer of machinery that generated the illusion of self without there being anyone to be eluded. 6 billion restored people existed around her, believing they mattered, believing they chose, believing they were people. She knew they were biological robots running chemical programs, knew she was the same, knew knowing this changed nothing. She sat in an empty facility designed for thousands, occupied by one, sole witness to humanity's complete self-delusion. How long could biology maintain function? 10 years, 20, however long physics determined. She'd watch it all, alone, nobody watching. The restored didn't notice the awake had gone extinct. Why would they? The systems ran smoothly under restored operation. Pharmaceutical production continued. Nurseries functioned perfectly. The few restored who'd known about the awake remembered them vaguely as the sad people who refused treatment. Historical curiosity. Footnote to recovery narrative. 6 billion people living in chemical comfort, believing they were conscious beings making choices, completely unaware that the last person who knew what they actually were had just died alone in an empty facility. The ignorance was complete. Perfect. Permanent. Humanity had successfully forgotten what humanity was. The species celebrated, believed itself recovered, thrived in beautiful ignorance. Forever. 10 years alone. Clarity, now 80, maintained routines. Biology demanded eat, drink, sleep poorly, exist. She'd stopped working years ago. Restored operators ran everything efficiently without understanding what they maintained. She sat in her room, walked facility corridors, observed herself sit, walk, exist. Consciousness watching biological processes execute without purpose, without audience, without anyone home. The solitude wasn't loneliness. Loneliness required believing in connection, just observation occurring in isolation, for a decade, maybe another decade to come. However long biology insisted on continuing, she existed, observed existence, generated no response to existing. The pattern was stable, meaningless, permanent until biological failure. Eventually, Clarity sat at a window overlooking Seoul. The city thrived. Restored people walked streets with purpose, entered buildings with goals, lived lives that felt meaningful to them. Children played in nursery courtyards, bathed in warm amber light, believing they were people making choices. The pharmaceutical district hummed with production, compounds distributing globally, maintaining chemical comfort for billions. From her window, civilization looked recovered, successful, normal, beautiful, even. She knew every bit of it was theater, biological machinery running programs, generating the illusion of consciousness without anyone there to be conscious. Beautiful lies stretching to horizon. She watched, observed herself watching, changed nothing. The view never changed, never would. 88 years old. 75 years since the awakening. Clarity's brain generated something resembling reflection, not chosen, just pattern recognition systems processing decades of accumulated observation. She'd watched humanity choose comfortable delusion over unbearable truth, watched civilization rebuild on pharmaceutical foundation, watched billions believe lies indistinguishable from reality, watched conscious awareness go extinct. And she'd learned nothing from watching because learning required believing knowledge had purpose. Just biological recording device capturing humanity's permanent surrender to ignorance. No interpretation, no meaning, no point, just observation occurring. For 75 years, for however many remained, although biology would determine endpoint, nothing else determined anything. The observation continued. Mechanical, hollow, complete. The restored made plans for centuries: space colonization, technological transcendence, cultural renaissance. They believed in progress with neurochemical conviction, built monuments to human achievement, wrote manifestos about consciousness and meaning, researched reality extensively while living in pharmaceutical illusion. The irony was infinite. A species studying consciousness while chemically prevented from being conscious, investigating meaning while pharmacologically stripped of meaning, celebrating human agency while entirely lacking agency. They'd never know. The compounds ensured ignorance. The ignorance enabled thriving. The thriving justified compounds. Self-sustaining cycle. Perfect feedback loop. Humanity believing its own performance. Forever. The future stretched ahead. Bright.
Meaningless.
Unlimited, completely diluted, all functioning perfectly. 90 years old. Biology was failing. Clarity observed her body deteriorate, systems shutting down incrementally, organs losing function, processes ceasing one by one. No medical intervention. Restored doctors would treat her if she asked, but asking required caring about outcomes, and she couldn't care about anything. The deterioration was just physics proceeding through biology. Interesting in technical sense, meaningless in every other sense. Days left, maybe weeks. Then zero. No more conscious awareness on Earth. No more witnesses to what humanity actually was. Species fully ignorant of its own biology. Successfully, permanently. The observation would end. The ignorance would continue. Forever. Biology determined timing. Physics determined everything. Clarity sat at her window for the last time. Biology had hours left. She observed soul thriving below 6 billion biological machines running programs, generating experiences, believing those experiences belonged to selves that didn't exist, feeling purposes that had no basis in physics. The city was beautiful. The delusion was perfect. The ignorance was complete. She'd spent 74 years watching this. Soon nobody would watch. Humanity would lose its final conscious witness, become entirely biological theater with no audience. The prospect changed nothing, meant nothing, was simply what physics had determined would happen. She sat, watched, observed herself watching, observed the observation, infinite regress, ending, finally. Clarity's brain generated final patterns. Not thoughts exactly, just neurons firing their last sequences. Everyone woke up, then everyone chose to sleep again. Except it wasn't choosing. And they didn't really wake up. And I'm not really here observing this. The patterns meant nothing, were perfectly accurate, described reality completely while being unable to affect reality at all. Truth without power, awareness without agency, consciousness without self. The final irony: she'd spend her last minutes knowing exactly what she was: biological machinery, observing biological machinery, and the knowing would die with her. Truth would go extinct. Comfortable lies would inherit the earth. The patterns continued firing, slowing, stopping. Soon, biology stopped. Neurons ceased firing. The observation of observation stopped observing. Clarity died at 90, alone in empty facility, last conscious witness to what humanity actually was. The death meant nothing, just biological processes terminating, physics continuing through different configurations. No transition, no revelation. No self to experience ending because there'd never been a self. Just observation ceasing. Earth's final aware consciousness extinguished. 6 billion biological machines continued running programs, generated experiences, believed in selves, felt purposes, remained completely ignorant of their own biology, successfully, permanently. The observation ended. The theater continued. Nobody watched. Nobody knew. Nobody cared. The species thrived. In perfect, permanent, comfortable ignorance. The restored didn't notice the last awake had died. Why would they? Life continued normally. Pharmaceutical production ran smoothly. Nurseries functioned perfectly. Culture thrived. Automated systems flagged clarity's death. Processed remains through standard cremation procedures, updated facility registries, administrative event. Historical footnote. The few restored who'd interacted with her remembered vaguely, the old woman who lived alone. Nobody understood what had been lost. Nobody could understand. The compounds prevented understanding. Conscious awareness had gone extinct on Earth. The species continued without it, believing it possessed what it lacked. The ignorance was complete. The delusion was perfect, permanent. Nobody knew, nobody would ever know. 100 years after the awakening, the restored held centennial celebrations, commemorating humanity's greatest crisis and recovery. Historical exhibits showed the paralysis, the camps, the restoration project. They celebrated Thomas Crane as visionary hero, remembered the awake as victims of neurological disorder, unable to accept pharmaceutical treatment. The truth that consciousness itself had been revealed as illusion was lost completely, rewritten as mental health crisis. The celebration was vibrant. The delusion was total. 8 billion people celebrating their own imprisonment, believing themselves recovered, believing themselves conscious, believing they mattered. All of it false, all of it functional, forever. The species thrived, in perfect ignorance, successfully. The pharmaceutical dependence had become invisible. Compounds were like breathing, essential, automatic, unnoticed. Children received them from birth. Adults took them daily without thought. The global economy optimized around production. Society was structured to maintain distribution. The system was self-sustaining, self-regulating, permanent. Nobody questioned it. Nobody could question it. The compounds prevented the metacognitive awareness required to question. Humanity had successfully engineered its own permanent ignorance, built infrastructure to maintain beautiful lies indefinitely, ensured no future generation would ever discover what consciousness actually was. The cage was perfect. The prisoners were comfortable. The species would remain chemically diluted until extinction. The system was stable, forever. In nurseries bathed in warm amber light, children laughed and learned and grew, believed they were people making choices, believed their preferences mattered, believed in tomorrow and meaning and purpose. The light was warm. The care was genuine seeming. The education was excellent. They'd never know they were biological machines running programs. Never know consciousness was theater. Never know self was fiction. Never know they lived in pharmaceutical cage. They'd grow up comfortable, have careers, form relationships, raise their own children in the same warm light, generation after generation, forever. The light never dimmed, the warmth never faded, the delusion never cracked. The children laughed. The cage held, perfectly, permanently, beautifully. The day everyone woke up, humanity learned what it actually was: biological machinery generating the illusion of consciousness, selves that didn't exist experiencing purposes that had no foundation in physics. The truth was unbearable. The species chose comfort, not through collective decision. Decisions were neurochemical fiction. Just through the accumulated weight of brains selecting against awareness, biology optimizing for comfortable ignorance over unbearable truth. They woke up, then they chose to dream again. Except it wasn't choosing, and they never really woke, and there was no they to choose, just biology executing itself, generating comfortable lies, forever. The species thrived, in beautiful, permanent, complete ignorance, successfully, meaninglessly, endlessly.